All right, well, welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Baker Institute Student Forum's public lecture, The Right Way Forward for Democracy in the Middle East. As you enter the building this evening, you may have passed underneath an epigraph reading, "To lend a meaningful voice." Our speaker this evening crosses cultures. As a Muslim, he appreciates and cherishes his Islamic religious heritage. As an American, he is keenly aware of the contrast posed by the infringement of rights institutionalized within political Islam. Dr. Jasser's own experience growing up American has led him to affirm the proposition that individuals have certain unalienable rights, rights that transcend every boundary of culture, language, religion, or geography. These are rights we call human, because we believe them to be shared among all human beings, not granted by a governing body or consensus of men and women, but simply a given for each and every member of the human race. Not all human rights, so-called, are agreed to be universal, it's true, but a few seem hardly separable from what it means to be human in the first place. The right to think freely, the right to freely express one's opinions, even if offensive to the sensibilities of another, the right to equal standing before the law regardless of one's race, ethnicity, language, or creed, the right to follow one's conscience in matters of religious belief or disbelief. Apart from freedom of thought, which itself cannot be externally regulated, each one of the preceding rights is systematically abridged under all four of the schools of Islamic law. The abridgment of these basic rights often gives a pretext for further abuses against minorities. And this is not an academic point. It touches the lives of real people. For the families of 24 Copts killed in Egypt in October with little reprisal, it's real. For the parents of 11-year-old Gloria and 7-year-old Martha Zaka killed on November 18th in an all too common attack on a Christian village by Muslim activists in the northern Nigeria Sharia state, or for Samaila Darabo, who lost his wife and 12-year-old daughter in the same string of attacks, it is real. For the parents of Niha, who in 2006, at 2.5 years old, was raped in Pakistan when her father would not convert to Islam, it is real. Around the world, in places where political Islam is the law of the land, the depriving of life and liberty is a reality expressed in honor killings, intimidation, rapes, theft of property, burning of homes and churches, and forced exile. And the victims are often blamed. Of course, we know this is not the whole picture, but this is definitely a real part of the picture. As such events occur in a context of democracy, it is clear that a simple call for the form of democracy alone is insufficient, but must include an affirmation of rights shared by all. Can democracy with affirmation of rights and equality under the law succeed in majority Muslim areas? Many have said no. Dr. Jasser and others who have joined him have said that it must. The way America and others face political Islam at home and abroad is much more than a simple question of cultural sensitivity, and this is the main point. Since being culturally sensitive toward institutionalized Sharia often means giving a pass to poor treatment of others, if those others are not Muslim men. The Arab Spring came on with a great fanfare and was driven in part by a very human yearning for justice. And yet, as things have unfolded, the haste and popular fervor, minus the underpinnings of a Bill of Rights, have now, in some cases, led back toward the dominance by free election of an ideology that will likely bring a human rights tragedy as a byproduct. So for all these reasons, it's my honor to introduce to you this evening Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an organization he created in the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the United States as an effort to provide an American Muslim voice, advocating for the preservation of the founding principles of the United States Constitution, which principles are as worthy of affirmation in Cairo, many of which as they are in Columbus. The centerpiece of Dr. Jasser's work has been his call for the separation of mosque and state, and to resist incursion of what some have termed creeping Sharia in the West. And I don't know if he would use that term, but I believe I'm reading that correctly. Dr. Jasser has earned his medical degree on a U.S. Navy scholarship in the Medical College of Wisconsin in 1992. He served 11 years as a medical officer in the U.S. Navy with tours of duty, including medical department head aboard the USS El Paso. He was chief resident at Bethesda Naval Hospital and staff internist for the Office of the attending physician to the U.S. Congress, and he is a recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal. Dr. Jasser is a physician currently in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona, specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology, and is a past president of the Arizona Medical Association. Dr. Jasser is a nationally recognized expert in the contest of ideas against political Islam and the American Islamist organizations. He has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, CNN, CBS, Fox News Channel, MSNBC, and BBC, in addition to nationally syndicated radio programs. Dr. Jasser has been presented with awards by the FBI and the Center for Security Policy. He is the contributor to several books and is the author of the forthcoming The Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim Patriot in a post-9/11 world, which you can all go out and pre-order on Amazon, I assume soon. And he has been featured in several documentaries, including America at Risk, Islam versus Islamists, A Question of Honor, and The Third Jihad. There will be a question and answer time at the end. Please join me now in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I looked at some of the speakers that you've had before me in the past few years, and I'm just humbled to be included amongst them. And, you know, when you look at the right way forward in democracy in the Middle East, I just, every day I turn on the news, and my family's from Syria, and as much as my heart goes out to just the impending tragedy that's happening there, I wish my grandfather was alive to see the Syrian people start to take responsibility for their own society. Not that they hadn't in the past, but they have finally found the means and the mechanism to do that. And yet, getting rid of a dictator for Egypt and Tunisia may have been easier than Syria, but it's only the first step in a very long journey. So what I'd like to walk with you through is the way I see that journey. I certainly, you know, we were talking earlier to some of the students, and my parents felt American the minute they came to the United States, and within a few moments of getting off the airplane, they felt American because it was a country that they understood welcomed immigrants, a country they understood would allow them to be more Muslim than any so-called Muslim country in the world. And yet, there were challenges as I grew up, and I may walk you through some of those. But yet, the concept of what it was to be a Muslim, I never had in conflict with what it was to be an American and what those ideas were of Americanism versus what it was to be a practicing Muslim. And now, as the Middle East, we see some of these countries changing, they're going to be struggling with what it means to be an Egyptian, what it means to be a Syrian or a Tunisian. And ultimately, the development of that identity shifts. There are tipping points in every society very rarely. And I would argue that it's important that we help, at least I see it, not only because Syria is my motherland, but I think that now in the global village that we live in, these tipping points happen very rarely. And as we saw in Iran, shifts and revolutions can happen once every generation or two and can shift them in the wrong direction to still be a threat, even though it may be a democracy. So how do we define democracy? I remember when we formed our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, we talked about actually taking the word democracy out and saying forum for liberty or freedom, because really that's what we're about, is liberty. But yet, this is the debate, is how do you create a functional democracy and what it is to live in a democracy. What I want to walk you through as I talk is the three aspects of where we are today, domestic and foreign situations, and actually hope when you leave here to divorce the concept that somehow everything you learn has to be compartmentalized. You know, say, well, we're going to talk about Egypt now, let's talk about the history with Mubarak and all that. Let's talk about Islam in America, which is different than Saudi Arabia. And yes, there's differences in every demographic and every aspect, but there are some common themes. And especially for American Muslims, many of us, especially in the Arabic community, are very young immigrants. And as a result, while I've been blessed with getting an education here in the United States, we would be in denial if we didn't admit that the education in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, is not full of the readings of Locke and Jefferson and Madison and Aristotle and existential philosophers and classical liberal thinking. So, You know, as much as we hope that immigration includes assimilation and internalization of American ideas, unless you've grown up studying those things, you're going to bring with you those ideas that you learned. So often you may learn some new ideas when you come here, but the basic building blocks of what you perceive as being a fair society may still be part of what you are as an American, even though you may have immigrated. Now, obviously, my family, I would probably tell you that my father was influenced significantly by living in London when he was young. My grandfather never lived in the West, but yet was very much Western in his thinking. So you can grow up in the Middle East and be very Western in those ideas. And I would argue that that's part of our problem with the paradigm, is that it's not just Western ideas, these are human ideas, human rights that are universal. And that's one of the paradigms that we need to shift, is that things that we have monopolized intellectually as being Western, I think are universal. So we'll talk about how we got here, what went wrong, which is Bernard Lewis's phrase, and wrote a very good book that sales spiked after 9/11 because people started to look at, well, what went wrong with the Muslim world over time, a culture that had been the source of intellectualism for hundreds of years, which the Jewish history books described as their golden age, then deteriorated into what we have today. And then solutions, which I think is the most important part of what we're talking about. Now, a lot of my activism in this has arisen out of 9/11, not because of necessarily the situation or the condition for Muslims in America, but because I woke up to the fact that something that I thought would naturally happen over time, which is modern thinking among Muslims, reform, separation of mosque and state, I realized that actually some of the more radical people I've ever met were born here. That some of the more unenlightened ideas from so-called Muslims actually came out of communities, ideas that somebody who had never been to the Middle East, like myself. So what is the reason for that? And I think it has to do with some of the lack of intellectual growth and the arrest of reform, the arrest of critical thinking within the Muslim consciousness. Now the question is, a lot of the people that are studying this get targeted as saying, well, they're Islamophobic, and it's anti-Islam to be critical of Quranic scripture, it's anti-Islam to be critical of certain things. And, I come to this as, sort of the type of Muslim on the left, right? The spiritual Muslim, the Muslim that believes closely in my scripture, the authenticity of the Quranic scripture, and many of the hadith. A Muslim that believes that Islam and God is a central part of my life. And the ultimate symbol of that is the Hajj and our pilgrimage to Mecca. But yet, outside of that mosque is probably one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. And yet, they have been charged with keeping the sanctity of the Holy Mosque, and created, if you look at 9/11, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and that's not a coincidence. And ultimately, whether it's Syria or anywhere else, the power of people to wake up finally, and the power of social media, I think will allow us to accelerate changes that have happened in the past, that happened in the West. I mean, if you look, we were talking to the students before about, sometimes I think we divorce ourselves of some of the realities of history. The West, Christendom did not wake up to the need to separate church and state until the Constitution became officially codified in 1789. And even with that, it took decades after that until we had our Civil War. And even with that, we needed another 100 years until we had a civil rights movement that began to actually understand what the Bill of Rights meant. And similarly, while you may have the intellectual pieces in place, it takes society a while to put the functional pieces into place to understand what universal rights are. So often one of the most difficult things that wrenches my heart is to hear some of the talking heads talk about Syria or Egypt and say, well, we have to be careful. Mubarak was an ally. What's going to come after? That type of thinking is very dangerous, because remember, radical Islam in the Middle East is a byproduct, not wholly, but is a byproduct of the environment of secular dictators in the Middle East. That ultimately this toxic political atmosphere in the Middle East has been a milieu that allowed the Brotherhood to foment its theocratic ideas that allowed the Islamic Revolution of Iran, for example, to rise up. The Wahhabis and their relationship with the King of Saudi Arabia and the monarchy there. All of these mutually parasitic relationships between fascisms. In Egypt, you had a mutual relationship between the secular dictator of Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. We saw the same thing among the Palestinians, for example. Mutual parasitism between Hamas, the theocrats, with Fatah, the secular Palestinian, a more racial movement. And you see this across the Middle East where there's no third pathway. And ultimately, our organization is focused on forming a third pathway. And we can't allow ourselves to too much focus on the symptom, which is terrorism. We've got to look at the cause. You know, I'm a physician by training, and yet have been a Muslim my whole life, grew up in Wisconsin, and realized that, you know, I was given my identity by not only through what my parents taught me intellectually, but by who I am every day, of what my parents emphasized as being America being their home. It was natural for me to want to join the Navy. And I think, you know, as much as this isn't a sports game, I think if you look, you know, I know you all love your Houston teams, and I'm coming to you from Phoenix. We're Phoenix, Arizona Cardinals fans, but I'm still sort of a Packers fan, and because I grew up in Wisconsin. Now, those are benign sports things. Take that out of sports and put it into the issue of nationalism versus belonging to a faith community. And go back and look at Faisal Shahzad's testimony to the judge in New York when he was the Times Square bomber. And in his testimony, he refused to have representation and basically said, you know, he wasn't guilty. And why was he not guilty? He said, because I have allegiance to the Muslim community, the Ummah, and I was a Muslim soldier, and I had to attack New Yorkers because they are the enemy, they are non-Muslim, and they're the infidels. And ultimately, if you're going to fix the problem of Muslim radicalization, you have to get to this concept of identity. And Prime Minister Cameron gave a speech last year in Munich where he talked about how for too long, because of multiculturalism, we have ignored British Muslim identity, and we have to start to focus on that. And I think so far, our foreign policy and domestic policy has had no strategy. We go from country to country dealing with which one flares up first. You know, we domestically deal with our terrorism issue as a whack-a-mole program. And our Homeland Security folks have been doing a great job at that. They really have. I mean, we've had one attack, which was in many ways may have been prevented at Fort Hood, but because of multicultural, politically correct issues, nobody really said anything about Nidal Hassan for some time. And ultimately, foreign policy, where, you know, we have a far more isolationist president in now, where with President Obama, but yet that hasn't done anything to fix the opinion of the United States in the Middle East. If anything, it's worse now than it's ever been. So during the campaign in 2008, there was this mantra that if we pull out of Iraq and pull out of Afghanistan, we won't be as hated. And I think the polls now are proving that not to be true. And so the question is, how do we improve the image of America in the Middle East? And I think it's because we're working too much on image and not enough on principles and what we stand for. If we spend, and it's just like any candidate, the candidate that starts working on their PR rather than working on their ideas and working on the core substance of what they stand for ends up typically losing, because it's clear that they're trying to sell a bill of goods. And I think similarly, we have to look at the scale of the problem. Domestic terrorism is not a separate problem from the issue in the foreign policy and the way we approach the Middle East. You know, at the end of the day, our organization is formed to separate mosque and state, and I truly believe that if a Muslim community can start to wholesale, or at least the majority, go through this enlightenment process that the West went through, go through a concept in which we can as a society begin to focus on government based in reason rather than government based in scriptural exegesis, I think that will have a huge impact on Muslims identifying with Western-type governments in Muslim-majority lands that they then feel is their own, that they then feel is Muslim and Islamic, and it doesn't have to be, quote-unquote, an Islamic state. And I think ultimately that can be the building blocks of a strategy. Not the transport and exportation of Americanism, but the exportation of the ideas that our founding fathers used when they were having the discussions in their constitutional convention. And I'll talk later about that. But I think one of the classic ones, for example, is, let's say, the discussion on whether I as a Muslim would drink alcohol. There's no doubt in the Quran there's an evolution of discussion about whether we should drink. One passage initially, God tells Muslims, do not come to your prayers drunk. And then later there's two other passages. And finally, there's a scripture that says wine or alcohol is prohibited to you. So I as a Muslim have chosen, based on that reading, I do not drink. I've never drank. Do I think government should have a law against alcohol purchase or sale? Absolutely not. But that's a liberty concept. That's a concept that through reason I could argue that governments that prohibit such things, number one, take away my ability to demonstrate my faith, so that is it faith unless I have a choice to go by it and choose and show God that I've chosen not to sin. So sin really is only sin if you have the ability to sin. So this is a concept that is based in reason, versus if you got a bunch of clerics together, they would say, well, Islamic law is pretty clear. God's law says that you have to outlaw alcohol because you can't sell it. Now in Malaysia and some of these supposedly more modern Islamic countries, they would tell you, well, Muslims can't sell it, but we let Christians and Jews and others sell it because they apply a different legal system to them. That doesn't work, because then all of a sudden you have a tiered system with different classes of laws for different people. And the way you prove that doesn't work is, imagine apostasy laws. So let's say I decide I'm Muslim and I decide to drink. The police approach me and say, well, you're a known Muslim, what are you doing drinking? And what if I say, well, you know what, today I've decided I'm a Christian. I've changed my religion. So how do you enforce these types of things when religion itself is a choice and you apply different laws to different faith groups? And obviously, I think unless you base a system based in reason, you're going to be doomed to failure there. And I think ultimately, what we need to do is look at the narrative, and the strategy I see is we're at a conflict now. Obviously, I think secular dictatorships are on their way out in the Middle East. I mean, that's not rocket science anymore. Because of social media, it's a matter of time. Now in Syria, because of the coalescence of the police, the intelligence, and the military, and the government into one unit. Egypt, there was a lot more fractionation. The military was in control, but the police and the intelligence were a little more fractionated, so it was a lot easier for the people to change there. Syria, it's completely coalesced into one almost family, basically, but one sect, and huge permeation of intelligence, so it's going to take a lot longer and probably tens of thousands of deaths unless you can stop Iran and Russia and some of the people giving fuel to that government. But ultimately, as secular dictators go, you're going to be left with the equal and opposite response to secular dictatorship, which is Islamism. How do you define Islamism? Islamism, and I contributed to a book called Islamism that debates this issue. There are many Muslims and intellectuals and universities across the country that think that that's an unfair term because it basically means terrorist to many people. I think, and many of us believe it's a great term, because in Arabic, that's what they're called. They're called Islamiyin. And Islamiyin in Arabic are those that believe that the state should be guided by the spirit and the principles of Islam, or the legal system should be guided by Islamic law or Sharia. Now, I'm not trying to demonize Sharia. Sharia plays a significant role in my own life. My wedding documents, marriage contract with my wife is based on our interpretation of Sharia. My last will and testament is based on my interpretation of Sharia, but not government's interpretation. And I think ultimately you want to separate between personal Sharia and governmental Sharia. Same thing with Islamism. Islamism, like communism, socialism, capitalism, is a societal system in which Islam becomes society's rules and society's system, versus liberty, which is based on the individual. And I'll get to a few graphics later that I think are good. Now, what I want to walk you through is, if I could spend an hour talking about each one of these differences, but if you compare lack of a better term, which is the West, but if you compare the West or the liberty narrative to Islamism, you have basically these different series here of differences among different principles. And basically, the individual is the center of the Western system versus the tribe. That's the center of the Islamic system. Individual ideas versus collective thinking. Pluralism versus tolerance. I mean, interesting, we talk a lot in the West about tolerance, But tolerance, I think, is still a very patronizing term. Islamists talk about tolerance where they say, well, listen, we allow, in a modern Islamist system, we allow churches to be built and synagogues to be built, and that's because that's what Islamic law allows. Well, if I was Christian, I wouldn't want my rights given at the whim of Islamic law. I would want it because it's the right thing to do, because it's the reasonable thing to do. And I think this is the issue, is that you don't tolerate other faiths, but actually the pluralism approach is that we all have equal access to God, and that you actually humbly say that I don't know if Islam is the right way. There may be other ways that are equally valid, which is, I think, very, very different. Minority rights in the West are more emphasized versus majority, which in the Islamist sense, they say, well, it's a democracy, so it's about elections. Well, that becomes 50% plus one oppression of the minority. Similarly, the concept of liberty versus democracy, and one of the things we were talking about earlier is the word democracy for a reason is not in our documents, because the Western American system, I believe, is more based in individual liberty. The secular republic versus theocracy. Democracy, which has good connotations, obviously, versus autocracy. One of the criticisms I get often from Islamists, I debated a ambassador from Saudi Arabia to a country in Europe once, and he stood up and said, well, Dr. Jasser, you're a doctor of medicine. You don't really have any qualifications to be talking about Islamic law and tell us that it should not be in government. And my response was, I'm not talking about I'm going to be the one to rewrite Sharia law. No, that's what the imams and the ulama or the scholars. I'm not an Islamic scholar of Sharia, but I'm an active Muslim citizen of my country and have an equal right to have an opinion about the role of clerics in government and the type of system that we use, the rules that we use for government. And I think ultimately this is, and my response was that I, as a physician, don't mandate my patients to take a prescription. I write them and they can go take it or not take it. And this is what the doctors of theology in the Islamist sense feel that, well, they talk about a Quranic passage that talks about shura or consultation in Arabic. But to them, democracy is related to an oligarchy, just for the ulama to make decisions for the rest of the community, versus every individual. And this is my difficulty. My parents have been involved, and I have been involved in building 4 or 5 mosques around the country. And many of them started out very well intended, but then ultimately a few in the community co-opted and controlled the mosque and prevented the regular women in the community, men that were liberal or may not be Sharia experts, from having influence. And they said, well, we're still democratic because our board votes. Well, remember, society is not a corporation. And this is the difference, is that they run them like corporations, and Saudi Arabia is run like a corporation, with the family, the Saud family, being the board of directors, and that's it. Nobody else gets a vote. But they say they run by consultation because they have a democracy of their board. What's the role of government? Protector of the individual or the protector of morality and God? Nationalism. So many times I've heard imams in this country saying that nationalism is sort of the evil of one of the vices of man. And yet they look upon the collective Muslim community, and yet they deny the desire to form a caliphate, but yet that's really what the caliphate is this unifying concept against nationalism. And then I think endemically in Islamist ideas is corruption versus honest interaction and the truth. I would remind you to all go back and look at de Tocqueville's discussion in Democracy in America about democracy needing a humble religious community in order to survive, because otherwise the government needs to monitor everything if people aren't moral and fear God, versus a dictatorship that really doesn't need that. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in the Arab Spring, is that if society, remember, my parents left there because you can't survive as an honest human being in Syria. You could not. The only people that survived in that Darwinian society were the corrupt and the people that lied about what they had, lied about their business, and grafted into positions of influence with the government. So ultimately, now after 40, 50 years of dictatorship, each of these societies is left with huge amounts of corruption in their systems. And the only ones that necessarily aren't corrupt are the ones that have become so fanatically Islamist that to them religion is just obsession. So this is why you have these two fascisms exchanging one another, and in the middle, the honest, moderate Muslims have been sort of lost in the mix, and everybody else, as have Christians and Jews and Baha'is and every other minority, as Dan was talking about in his introduction. Sanctity of life and humanitarianism versus dehumanization. It's amazing to me how our country can get excited and passionate about one life, a baby dropping down the well that we want to get, or minors that are stuck. And the culture, I'll tell you, in the Middle East is very different. And this is because of sort of a dehumanization that happens over time after living in dictatorship, where the individual is not as important as the tribe. And people say, you know, you've heard more and more about honor killings. It's because, not that this is a new phenomena, it's actually increasing lately because of this sectarian divide that's happening. But at the end of the day, this is a phenomenon that's pretty common, not that common to any Muslims I've known, but it's less of an Islamic issue than it is a tribal phenomena in which they co-opt religious pride in Islam and Muslims with oppressing women, oppressing the freedom of a daughter or a wife to be able to leave her home, divorce, or date, or other things, and you've seen more and more of this in the news. Freedom of speech versus blasphemy laws, and freedom of choice, freedom to leave or exit Islam, and apostasy laws. Now, many apologists for Islam in America, or Islamism, I should say, will tell you that, well, apostasy is, you know, they'll say they disagree with apostasy laws in America, but yet when you ask them about Muslim countries, they'll say, well, you can criticize Islam as long as it doesn't create chaos, and they'll talk about fitna in Arabic. And what's interesting is that, you know, if you look at the history in Islamic history, there was a mixture in that there were many Muslims in the military that fought with the Prophet Muhammad that were told, just like when I was in the Navy, I couldn't decide to leave the military when I was serving my commitment. If I had left, it would be desertion or unauthorized absence, or if we were at a war, it would be treason. And similarly, in the Muslim military, there was punishments for Muslims that left the military. But that doesn't mean that that has to do with believing in God or choosing to be Muslim or not Muslim. And this is where the exegesis of that type of interpretation, over time, the Wahhabis and others co-opted, and they mixed roles of Muslims in their military with belonging to the Ummah, which is the entire Muslim community. And I think if you look West versus, you know, it's interesting how we react to things in this country cognitively versus viscerally. In the Muslim, I can't tell you how many times my work gets tarnished and tarred by so many activists that may often be well-intended, but they think I'm just anti-Muslim, rather than they look at the fact that I'm anti-Islamist. And they react viscerally because we're a minority in America. But yet, if you say the same thing in Egypt, being against the Muslim Brotherhood, you're not targeted as being anti-Islamic, that you're basically targeted as a secularist or as somebody who doesn't believe in a party being political. And then other differences between natural law, constitutional law versus Sharia. And each of these could be texts in and of themselves. So how do we, you know, I want to take a few minutes to review some of the history of how we got here. Some of it's tribalism. And so many of the, you know, I mean, this is the family of the Prophet, and here in the middle there you've got Muhammad and his family, and one of the largest divisions in Islam were between Ali and Muhammad, which those who believe they descended from Ali follow the Shia tradition versus the Sunni tradition, which is 90% of the Muslim population. Shia are about 10%. But ultimately, if you look at a lot of the countries in the Middle East, this is a long list of all of the caliphs and dynasties. The longest one there is the Ottomans from 1280 to 1922. That included control over Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, etc. But I think ultimately, if you look, as much as now we talk about Islam as theocracy, we forget that most of Islamic history was actually dynastical, and it wasn't theocratic. That there were many, under these dynasties, there were different, you know, one of the saddest things is right now in Sunni Islam, for example, there's 4 schools of thought. Hanafi, Hanbali, you know, Shafi'i, and Maliki. There used to be thousands, you know, and slowly they withered down. And I think part of what I would like to study more is to find out that process in which they withered down just down to 4 schools of thought, I think would tell us the sign of what happened to critical thinking in Islam. And ultimately, if you look at the different empires that were there, the Ottoman Empire, the different dynasties that existed in northern Africa in the 15th century, and then ultimately into 1900s, you find that the Muslim majority countries of today, you can't divorce the impact of history. And if you take 400 years of Ottoman control, that included outlawing the Arabic language. I mean, how can you reform a faith whose textbook is based in a language that is one of the most difficult languages to learn in the world? And if that language is based in a tradition that the countries that were Muslim majority, like Turkey or the Ottomans, outlawed, how would you be able to reform that? It was almost like, if you look at the Catholic tradition, for the first 300 years, the Catholic Church outlawed the discussions in Latin and outlawed people studying Latin. What better way to control the Christian community? And so similarly, the Ottomans, in their desire to secularize their society, especially Ataturk, outlawed Arabic language and did so supposedly from a secular mindset. And ultimately, you see now Turkey having a big problem with Islamism because they pushed this issue underground and didn't deal with it publicly. You put on top of the Ottoman issue colonialism, where in many ways I think, this is also not a very popular thing to say among Muslims, but in some ways colonialism helped us because it brought the ideas of Western, if you look at Indian education and same thing with the Syrian system, there's a lot of French influence in the Syrian system. There were some positivity. However, it's also some of the deep pathologies in that they were foreign ideas brought to them that they weren't able to identify internally with and didn't have an indigenous root, so therefore it was very pathological ultimately. And I think those two things, Ottoman history, colonialism, then you have World War I, World War II, that then left this type of nationalism, which it's interesting. I talk to my Syrian friends, and they watch Syrian soccer, and they're cheering for the Syrian soccer team. And I ask them, I say, did your grandfathers cheer for that? And they say, well, no, there was no Syria before 1940, 6 or 40, whenever Syrian independence was. And I'll say, look, you already have this in your blood. You haven't even, I talk to friends that are my age that parents are from Syria and they've never even been there, but yet they have the Syrian nationalism within them. So it's something that can be quickly taught. And I think the colonial era left some of this nationalism that I don't think needs to be changed, but ultimately can create within it a liberty doctrine that I think should be part of our policies. And then ultimately it evolved into what we see as common day Middle East. Now, ultimately, I think one of the biggest tipping points in the Middle East was Saudi Arabia in 1979. You had an uprising of students that had been influenced by the Brotherhood or Ikhwan, and they called for the overthrow of the House of Saud, and where the Hajj happens, and there were attacks during the November Hajj in 1979, and this left a standoff for a while, and that standoff ultimately ended in an agreement in which the Islamists or the Salafists, including the Wahhabi, basically, tribe of Saudi Arabia, were given control of the judiciary and the legal system in Saudi Arabia in exchange that the monarchy was able to maintain control of government and the military. And that agreement has basically still been in place, and the Wahhabis have basically been in control of the educational religious system in Saudi Arabia, and that, with the on the heels of petrodollars, has allowed them to spread their interpretation. You take one little small tribe, which, if it wasn't for petrodollars, billions of dollars spent in, and Jim Woolsey quotes $90 billion spent on propaganda, Wahhabi propaganda to schools and mosques all over the world, they wouldn't have as much influence as their ideas would warrant because of how backwards the Wahhabi ideas are. And then obviously there's also a byproduct of the conflicts in the 1990s. I think ultimately, if you look at Bosnia Herzegovina, you had a time in which ethnicity displaced religion, and you had the ethnification of Islam, where all of a sudden it was called ethnic cleansing, when in fact it had more to do with faith identity, which even more confused this concept of mixture of faith and religion, and I think faith and racial identity. And ultimately, that's really important because I'll tell you, one of the people that influenced my ideas the most was some of the writings of Elijah Izbegovic, who was the president of Bosnia after Tito's reign ended. And, you know, he talked about, and he had a book called Islam Between East and West, and he talked about how to him, he could lose every right he had in society and he would still be Muslim because he would still have God. And he said when he was in solitary confinement, he was never closer to God than when he was in solitary confinement. So therefore, he talks in his book about how if that's Islam, then he really doesn't need government for Islam, and therefore he talks about what we need government for is human rights, creativity, and being human, and allowing us to get along with our differences. And I think this is one of the core aspects that if we want to see the Middle East change, we need to, I think, translate these ideas into widgets that we can put into cartoons, put into poetry, put into a war of ideas that are a battle or contest of ideas that can then translate into these various countries to help those on the ground. I think ultimately, how do you transform secular modernism, the ideas of secular modernism, into Islamic narrative? And I think this is one of the most difficult things, because in Islam, for example, we don't have a church, but yet we've created this pseudo-clergy. There's been a loss of faith and principles and ethics over time, and before the Arab Spring, there was a loss of will to revolt. Many of, I mean, you talk to people that had been through the Middle East, and they'll tell you that one of the most passive people were Syrians, and that's because of the culture of fear that had been created over time. But now we're seeing that break, and I think we have to be careful not to let now us have a response of isolationism, because if we become too isolationists, the strong horse, as Lee Smith wrote in his book called The Strong Horse, will end up winning. And if we allow the Darwinian process to happen and we don't give the freedom activists, the liberty-minded, the classical liberals, and those, they exist there. Believe me, there are, and I didn't get these ideas out of a vacuum. There are many modern-type thinkers that exist in the Middle East that came out of the Nassers of the world, the National Socialists, and realized that socialism wasn't a way to allow human rights to be advocated for. And some of them are Abdul Karim al-Saroush from Iran, and Bassam Tibi, who then was in Germany for most of his life. And in Emory, there's Abdullah Naim, who has talked about Islam and the secular state, and he came from Sudan. And there's many more like them. Muhammad Abdu, in the early 20th century, was also a reformer in Egypt that had talked quite a bit about the role of the secular state. Now, ultimately, as we see the benevolent dictators, as they've been called, disappearing, what's going to happen? And one of our fears is weapons of mass destruction and American security if they get in the wrong hands. So sometimes we've decided that the enemy of our enemy is going to be our friend and somebody who we help. And I think ultimately what we need to do is change that paradigm. Change the paradigm that countries are either our friend or our enemy, that it's black and white, that somehow we need to have a grading process. And I talk about this in my book, where I talk about that we need to have a scale of A to F, where we can work with anybody who may have a common mission with us, let's say fighting Al-Qaeda or fighting Hezbollah or the Iranian nuclear program, etc. But yet, just because the Saudis may be with us against Iran, that does not mean that we hug them and say that their societies are wonderful, and that ultimately we need to, if we're going to defend the women's rights in their country and have credibility as a nation in approaching the Arab street and approaching the Muslim street in these countries, we need to not only say what we mean, but mean what we say. And this is one of the differences, I think, when you look in foreign policy that changed with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that ultimately it was no longer a paradigm of simply working against the Soviets, and that the Middle East was just sort of this, the enemies of our enemy were our friend, but now ultimately we can start working with countries that were sharing our values. And I think this is where the president and others need to be clear on what those values are. I think the president's speech in Cairo, for example, said some of the right things about minority rights and some of the right things about the positive history of Islam. but did not go anywhere near far enough on reform that needs to happen within the Muslim consciousness about the way minorities are treated and what are the obstacles. The fact that the Islamic State and the concept of theocracy is one of the main obstacles. The fact that the Muslim Brotherhood as a party in Egypt is the primary obstacle to democracy in Egypt. And that ultimately our inability and our weakness in addressing Islamism as an ideology has prevented the shifts in reform, I think, that need to happen. So ultimately, I mean, these societies where they separate Muslims and non-Muslims and look upon various communities as being unequal, I think ultimately needs to change. And reform, I believe, and as most Muslims will tell you, is an inherent part of Islam. Ijtihad is Arabic for the critical interpretation of Islamic law in light of modern day, and that can happen. And many will tell you that the doors of reform were closed back in the 13th and 14th century. But how do you do that? They'll say that, well, you know, Zuhdi, you're not qualified. You need to have a PhD in Sharia in order to do ijtihad. That's true. I'm not saying that, you know, just like the medical example, I'm not going to be writing the prescriptions for these things, but we need to build the institutions that can house the imams, that can give them the freedom to start to ask questions that they would be killed for in Saudi Arabia, that they would be told to be apostates in Egypt and elsewhere, where if they say that Islam should not have a political party, that they will not be demonized as being anti-Muslim or anti-Islam. So our mission of our organization, the solution that I see, is to advocate for the preservation of the U.S. Constitution and the separation of mosque and state. And that ultimately these ideas can be fed through these principles. Now, if you look at the panoply of organizations in America, and I think American Muslims are uniquely positioned to do this work, because if I was to do this and say this, have this speech in the Middle East, you can look and see what the life expectancy is of liberal thinkers in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or elsewhere. As you see now, our NGOs that we were helping 2 weeks ago have been shut down. The Egyptian military is imprisoning some of them. Why? Because they were presenting ideas that ran against some of the thuggish groups like the Brotherhood and others that are in the Egyptian power structure right now. And as much as many of these groups in America may be well-intended, if you look at their history, many of them that claim to speak for our community came out of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy mindset and brought with them often many of these ideas that are embedded in the concept of Muslim collectivism, Muslim ideas as a political party. And if you look at the writings of Sayyid Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, and you look at some of the documents in which the Islamic Society of North America and others inspire, you will find that it has to do with Islamic law and the concept of a Muslim collective mindset. And as much as they may be free to do that, I think we as Americans should understand that Muslims are diverse, that we don't all agree with that, and that while these groups may deny belonging to the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood doesn't have a party here in America, I would ask you to look at what work they've done at reform for separation of mosque and state, what work they've done to identify what areas of ijtihad need to happen. And I've done panels with some of their imams in which they'll say, well, in America we follow the laws of the land, which is true. These are not anarchists. These are very law-abiding, God-fearing Muslims. But yet, when you talk to them about Muslim-majority countries, they'll feel that the Islamic State concept is very appropriate, that the Muslim Brotherhood, as long as they condemn violence and terrorism, is a good group. And this is where I think that to assess that Muslims somehow should be sentenced to always having Islamists is, I think, wrong-headed. And we as a nation should begin to try to take some sides in this battle. I think we should engage all groups, engage ISNA, engage CARE, but also engage new emerging groups. We've formed an American Islamic Leadership Coalition that is looking at new networks, non-Islamist, anti-Islamist, that are looking at reform within various communities in Canada and North America. This debate is hard. I mean, the Center for American Progress and other groups have they'll demonize even our work and say that we're anti-Muslim, because they will use the Islamic issue as a political, one-upsmanship, if you will, against the right and against conservatives, or the left, or the right using it against the left. And I think often that stifles debate in America. I want to leave you with one graphic that, if you look, for example, at the entire Muslim population, 1.5 billion Muslims, 3 million in the US, let's say 3 to 4 million. And you look at a spectrum from secularism to theocracy. If secularism is on the left versus theocracy on the right, fascism is not unique to the theocratic mindset. As we know, and as I mentioned, it can happen in secularism too. In between, there's a whole spectrum between those that are intensely secular, that don't want Islam in their life, versus those that are intensely Islamist. And there's a continuum there, just as there is in Christianity, as there is in Judaism, as there is in every faith. The issue is that line between those that want the center part of society being Islam versus those that want the individual and human rights to be the center of society. And that debate, that messy line, where Islam to me is a central part of my life, but I don't want it to be a central part of government. That debate is a debate that is going to be raging in the Middle East, in every one of these countries. And if we continue to be silent, we're going to be giving that debate over to the Islamists, because they have the most organized. I mean, look at Tunisia. The reason the Islamists and the Nahda party won was because they were the most organized. The secular parties divided themselves into 80 parties, divided the vote, and the Nahda won 70-80% of the vote. That's going to happen. Imagine the Democrats tomorrow divide their party into 80 parties. The Republicans would win every party, every election. So this is exactly what happened in the last election. It's also happening in Egypt. Anyone that thinks that Islamists are a majority of Egypt, I think, is foolhardy. The reason they got 45-50% of the vote was the secularists weren't organized and they had no unifying idea. They divided themselves between communists and far right and tons of different parties, while the Islamists unified. And we see the same thing in the United States. Most of the groups speaking for our faith community are those that are organized and fervent under the Islamic banner, while the rest of us are involved in Republican, Democratic politics and Rotary clubs and civic organizations, and we haven't unified to give you that one voice, so therefore we look like we're diverse, when in fact, if you look at Muslims that are active in America, 30% are mosque going. So if you look at the 3 million, this group, for example, CARE, that claims to be the largest Muslim organization, has a membership in the thousands. You know, maybe they have 30 chapters. If you say that they have, in a poll from Abu Dhabi and Gallup said that 6 to 12% of American Muslims identify with them. So that means some 90% of American Muslims do not identify with that organization. And I think that's very important. So ultimately, to separate mosque and state, and these are the memes or the ideas I think need to happen through the Middle East. A Muslim understanding of a government with an establishment clause, and break that down into pieces that can sell in the Middle East. Why you need a government with an establishment clause. Why you can have a government based on Islamic values. And one of the greatest phrases is from President Wahid in Indonesia, who said that you can be in a state of Islam, but not be in an Islamic state. And that he wrote a book called The Illusion of the Islamic State, which is ultimately this concept of the Islamic State is an illusion. Just like Sharia and government. I might believe personally in Sharia as the pathway to God, but to put it into government is actually man-made law. That's not God's law. Once man and woman put that into government, that becomes man's law. That's not God's law. God's law is what I and God have as a conversation between us. Once it's in government, it's not that. And then we need to redefine the ummah. And I've talked about de-ummatizing Islam. And that's not heresy. Ummah can mean two things. One is community, which is wonderful for socialization, education, and celebrating holidays and prayer and other things. That's very important. We need that. Charity. But ummah as nation, which is also what it means, that definition needs to be put into the dustbin of history and the end of the Islamic State. I'm going to go through some of these slides. There are slides on radicalization, and I don't want to, we can go into the question and answer on this, but there's these 3 slides I want to end with. So we see all of these aspects of society, our legal system, history, morals, our free markets, social networks, knowledge, education. In an Islamist system, to them, Islam is the center of that. That's all well and good, maybe at home at my dinner table. That's great. To my family, Islam is the center of who we are. To society, I think that's toxic, even if 99% of the community is Islamic. Because remember, the first people to get targeted by Islamists or Wahhabists or Salafists or whatever you want to call them are moderate Muslims that don't want to toe the line of the clerics. So what others? So if it's not Islam, what is it going to be? Secularism, Europe has found that this anti-religious or laïcité policies they've had in France and others is actually also toxic. Because if you live in a society where religion gets targeted, you will actually stimulate radicalization. And that's why Europe has a much greater radicalization problem than we do in America, because America is a very pro-religious secular society. So what do? I think that the solution to that is to take these same communal systems and say that the center of society is not a particular religion, but it's God. Any way you want to interpret it, it's God. And from that, you have a relationship with God through individual freedom, through liberty, and through universal human rights. And that common language, you can then translate and say, okay, fine, go to your synagogue, go to your mosque, figure out your own interpretation of that. But when you come to Congress or come to your state legislature, this is our common language. We have a government under God with universal principles. If you look at the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, it's very different than the UN Declaration, and there's a reason there. They have blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, things that they base in Sharia because they don't believe in this system. And the OIC, which I would love to see America say, you know, why does every Muslim majority country have to form a cooperation of 56 countries? What would they feel if Christian countries got together and formed a, OCC, Organization of Christian Cooperation? I mean, that would create a huge amount of controversy in the world. And I think ultimately, this is what we're not transporting Americanism, we're transporting the concept of the importance of God in society and those values. And I think ultimately, the nation state, that I scribbled on there, and allegiance to that nation state, I think, is the core of identity and how we can teach that. And this concept of liberty between either fascism and last, I want to leave you with a couple slides from our Liberty Project. We discussed these same principles with youth that we brought in from 12 states that were Muslims that really believed in the work that we're doing. And we talked about, and they created their own mission and now are working on social media and Facebook and Twitter. And we're having our second retreat this April. And ultimately, it's very difficult because some of these concepts are not easy to grasp. And yet, so many Muslims feel that this country's ideas are theirs, but we haven't yet created the theology, the ideas, and the strength for them to speak back to the imams and even their parents and tell them, I love you and I love my faith, but yet I disagree with the way it's politicized and the way our mosques are often used for a political agenda. And I have some literature for you that you may have gotten on the way in about it, what our Liberty Project does. And the top-down approach of that is our American Islamic Leadership Coalition, which this was a meeting we had on Capitol Hill with various members of Congress and others that we're beginning to show them that there is a coalition of organizations that can become some of the foundational aspects in which foreign policy in the Middle East can be looked upon in a way that in America we can have a laboratory to export these ideas. So ultimately there was there was a conversation that George Mason had with James Madison, in which Madison advocated for the removal of the word Christian from the Constitution, and yet he felt that it was very Christian. You could have a very Christian society without specifically saying that it was Christian, that the ideas were Christian, or that the Constitution was Christian. And ultimately, George Mason lost that debate, and we had the Constitution that we have. And I think Muslims can go through that same evolution. So, sorry I went over a little bit. There's a lot of material there, but I appreciate the time, and I'd be more than happy to take any of your questions. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned some mosques that you had started that had an end result that was different than what maybe was originally intended. Can you speak to how you would sort of address that issue? And then you also skipped some of the slides about radicalization. Can you talk about your ideas on that?
Yeah. You talking mosques in America that we had started? Yeah, I mean, in my book, for example, I talk in the beginning about, to me, the mosque that my family had built, there were 4 or 5 families in northern Wisconsin that got together and built that mosque. And it was all about memorizing Quran, about learning the scripture, what the meaning was, about values of what were Islamic values, about honesty, morality, and character and integrity. And, you know, to me, Islamic principles were, I remember one of the things about being taught that it's not just doing the acts or the pillars of the faith, but actually living a life where, you know, the best form of da'wah, for example, which da'wah means education, but it can also mean evangelism. But that is to live a life by example, that we are here in America not to spread Islam, but rather to bring in American ideas into our faith and into our practice. It's two different approaches. And, you know, I remember my parents, when they built the small little humble mosque in Wisconsin, saying that, you know, even if the money fell from the sky from the Saudis, they wouldn't want to build it because, you know, it's more important that it represents certain principles that are humble rather than being these ostensive structures that are coming from societies where they should have left their money in their society to help the poor in Saudi Arabia or to help the poor in their Gulf states and help create educational systems that have critical thinking. So that was sort of the mosque concept I had. In Scottsdale, for example, after 9/11, I had been involved in our mosque, and we had just gotten a permission to build, but it hadn't been reviewed yet. And then 9/11 happened, and in November 2001, all of a sudden there was a huge protest about our mosque in Scottsdale. And I remember being asked by our board to help them through that process, and I willingly did. And we made some compromises in the structure, but ultimately, and I remember one of the city council people saying that, you know, are you sure, Dr. Jasser, this is the right time for your community to be building a mosque? And I said, you know, if you care about our nation and what it stands for, this is the right time for you to remind us what America stands for. And having said that, I was actually very vocal against this so-called Ground Zero mosque, because I also felt as an American Muslim that it was not about religious freedom. There was a mosque closer to Ground Zero than that one, and that structure, if it was really a mosque, doesn't need that much space. But it was more about a 15-story, $150 million structure. The most expensive mosque that I know of that's been built by American money is, you know, in the orders of a few $1,000,000. But most of the mosques that are $15, $20 million in America are foreign funded. So this is why I had a big problem in that the people building it would not forswear foreign money. And I think it really is a terrible statement to say that you would take foreign money to build something, and especially from an identity, and I talked about identity, from an American identity standpoint, to take the place that this war started and put an Islamic structure was just, I thought, inappropriate, even though they had a right. I do believe they had a right to do it. So the issue of mosques also, I think, is important, and I got a lot of criticism during the whole hoopla about the radicalization test hearings I gave in March 2011, earlier last year, with Congressman King. And I talked about this process of radicalization. And if you're critical of some thoughts and ideas presented in some mosques, does that mean you're generalizing about all mosques and all Muslims? Absolutely not. And radicalization has a process. Nidal Hassan did not, you know, if you look at his resume, it's like mine. He's an army doctor, son of immigrants, wanted to serve his country, but then all of a sudden, and it wasn't all of a sudden, he ended up shooting and killing 13 of his fellow army soldiers and injuring over 30. And how did that happen? He was walking around Walter Reed with a card that said "Soldier of Allah." So, and nobody reported him because they were probably afraid of being targeted by groups like CARE or others as being anti-Muslim, and yet you had this guy who was radicalizing right in front of their eyes. And at the end of the day, I think the initial tipping point for his personality is not that he was crazy. And if you look at some of bin Laden's quotes, he talks about Islam being a way of life, etc. His tipping point was early in life, in which his identity was that he didn't identify with America as his, and that he felt as a Muslim that America was against Islam and against Muslims, and ultimately he got driven to the crazy militancy part of it. Yes, the militancy is crazy, but the Islamism is not. And I've seen mosques where they have spread ideas about America, nonviolent ideas, but very hateful, very anti-American ideas that I think in the wrong ears to the wrong students or wrong people in that mosque can be very radicalizing. And not overnight, but it would happen over time. I mean, Al Jazeera is a good example. yes, it's it's better media than exists in a lot of the Middle East, but a lot of the stuff that they're pushing on America and the West in that media needs some balance from American Muslims. And it really bothers me, for example, when you see groups like CARE. CARE appears on Iranian TV all the time. They're on Press TV. Out of their last 50 media appearances, 27 of them have been on Press TV. So Press TV is the media arm of the Iranian government. And they go on Iranian TV and talk about American Islamic, negativity. And yet they won't criticize the Iranian regime, etc., on that television. So this is the issue, is that we can't say one thing on one place and not say it in the other. And radicalization is a continuum. I think that the source is political Islam, and that when you don't identify with the ideas, not with patriotism, you can be very patriotic but yet be an Islamist because your vision of America is a Islamic state, but yet believe in the Establishment Clause and teach that the Islamic State is no longer necessary. Teach that, for all the times CARE has denied being part of the Brotherhood movement, when have they criticized the Brotherhood? When have they said Hamas movement is wrong politically? That when have they criticized any of these Islamic movements? That's how you earn credibility in my mind as being anti-Islamist, is when you criticize these movements. And the mosques that are supporting these Muslim Islamist movements, I think, are part of the radicalization process. And as far as what percentage, it's hard to tell. I think we need to study that and see what the permeation of the Islamist ideas are within the Muslim community. Yes. No, nothing. Please, if you want to, nothing would offend me. Actually, the only bad questions are the ones you leave here without asking me.
So let me understand Muslim and Islam, or Islamist, or maybe a definition there, so I can understand the differences, or say Muslim is to Islam as something else is to something else, maybe. Yeah,
a Muslim is somebody who practices the faith of Islam, just like Christian is to Christianity. So a Muslim is the practitioner of the faith. Islam is the faith itself. Islamist is a political identification of a person who believes in the political movement of Islam, not only as a faith, but as a legal movement, a party, a political movement with a platform, whether it be in Egypt or even as a minority in America. It could be somebody that believes in sort of the political movement of Muslims as a party. Islam, the word, some say, well, it means peace. It actually means submission. Salam, Islam is a submission to God. So Muslim actually, by definition, means submitter to God. That's why there's a passage that talks about Abraham, and that some interpret that it means that he was a Muslim. That's sort of, I think, a very Salafist, a supremacist interpretation that somehow Abraham was also a Muslim. But at the end of the day, I think what it means is that he submitted to God, just like every Jewish Christian believer believes in the people we call them the people of the book, or those that believe in the God of Abraham. That's the definition. Now, there's other terms. Jihad, for example, is another term that people ask me to define. Jihad does have some positive and negative meanings. Obviously, in the 21st century, it means holy war. I have some good friends. Their first name is Jihad. Their mother and father did not desire to name them holy war. It actually is a very positive term of, internal struggle for righteousness, for doing good. It can mean humility internally. But over time, because of these radical groups, it's sort of like trying to prove that Xerox doesn't mean copy. It's a separate term now. Islamic Jihad is a militant. Now, obviously, in the Quran, Jihad has multiple meanings. One of them is and some actually call it the sixth pillar, which is the obligation to fight to defend the Muslim community if it's attacked. But that's another very controversial term. Yes.
Where have you found the most success so far between Sunni Shias and Ismailis?
Between the sectarian groups?
Yeah, within the states, where have you found the most support for your movement? Or for your group?
Oh, I see what you mean. That's a good question. I think if you were to pigeonhole the Muslim community as far as which ones appeal to these ideas, I would think it's across the board. It's interesting. Some in the Shia community are very supportive because of their own understanding very quickly of what happens with theocracy in Iran, for example. Some in, probably more so, I would say, if to generalize, the Sufi community is probably more supportive just because they have a far more central focus on spirituality and rather than governmental control. But the Sunni community also is, I mean, most of our board is Sunni, but that's probably because of my own, bias of my own context and my own cliques that I hang around based on being Syrian. And that has nothing to do with any demographic per se. But I think each community, now you mentioned Ismaili and Ahmadiyyas and others, those are persecuted minorities. The persecuted minorities in Islam and the Muslim communities are very, very supportive of what we're doing. Because, if you look in Pakistan or in many of the Muslim majority countries, many of these groups aren't even considered Muslims, when in fact they are. I mean, in Islam you can't do takfir. Takfir is to call somebody a non-Muslim. And I've been targeted by these attacks many times, but there are entire sects that are called non-Muslim. Ultimately one other step of reform is to start prohibiting completely any concept of takfir, especially since we don't have a church, we don't have a communication or excommunication, but yet that's one of the most common attacks that the radicals will give. And actually subtly, that's what many of the groups do to me, right? They say, you may have seen this whole controversy last week with the NYPD and our film that we put together, or I narrated, called The Third Jihad, was put together by the Clarion Fund. And, the New York Times basically, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Post saying I was treated by the New York Times the same way Al-Qaeda treated me, which was that the New York Times said that, this was a hateful film. That's what it was called. And yet it's a film about radicalization, about which groups are moving Muslims towards that pathway, even though they're nonviolent, they may be deceiving, deceptive in some of their language. And if you use, for example, the head of Tunisia now, the head party, Ennahda, has said things in Arabic very different than what he's saying in English. I mean, that's all I talk about in the movie, about some of these different aspects of groups that can lead towards radicalization, but yet they labeled it as hateful, basically saying that I don't fit in the Muslim community, that I'm doing things that are anti-Muslim, which is exactly what radical Islamic groups say. But obviously the New York Times agenda is very different. They want to target NYPD, they want to target Ray Kelly as being, on some type of crusade or whatever. So they're, I'm just sort of a lateral, collateral damage. Not that their intention is to do takfir, but ultimately it's the same thing. Yes?
I have a question. You mentioned about being an American in America and then, following the Sharia as well. And then, doing Sharia at home, being an American, and following the Constitution in everyday life. Where does the identity crisis come in? Being where should I stop following the Constitution? Where should I start following the Sharia?
Can you explain, what do you mean as far as identity? You don't see there's a conflict with the identity, or do you?
Yeah, I'm saying it could be, right? There can be like an identity crisis
between.
Oh, how do I resolve that conflict?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the focus of our. I mean, that's a great question, and I think ultimately the way you resolve it is, it's interesting. And I think Christian and Jewish families that are conservative and others go through this same thing. Is, what happens is because, and I don't know if this is because our families are immigrants or what, but I mean, even my own family that was just this intensely patriotic family. I mean, it's one of the reasons I joined the Navy. It's sort of how I was conditioned, right? But yet still, when my mom was worried about me drinking and getting involved in bad activities at school, sometimes they'd say, "Oh, don't do like don't do like the Americans do. Don't party and drink and date and all these kind of things." And there's this kind of generalization that, well, how do I identify my kids and tell them we're not like, what's the them? Does that disappear with generations? Sometimes it doesn't. I think it does in some ways, as long as your core values are to truly love a positive sense of what America stands for. And what does America mean? And I think this is when I talk to non-Muslim groups, one of the first things I tell them is, I don't expect you to become experts in Sharia or Islam. I want you to sort of go back and relook at American history and understand what it is to be an American, because we're forgetting that today. And that's what we need to advocate for. One of the things that members of Congress asked me during the hearings were, well, Dr. Jasser, what you said is all well and good, but this is not our job, this is your job. Why are you testifying about this stuff here? And I'll tell them, well, remember, our founding fathers felt very comfortable in talking about religion in their identification with their definition of what it meant to be an American. They talked about theology quite a bit. And now all of a sudden you can't talk about theology anymore. And if you do, you're either labeled as a far right or a far left as being anti-religious. And that somehow you can't talk about it. And I think this is part of what of our repair as we do counter-radicalization, is to begin to talk about religion, not only Islamic religion, but Christianity and Judaism, and get it much more a part of our public life so that we're not anti-religious. And I think that identification, if our youth can identify being an American with being a very pious Muslim, with being, and that's saying that, you know what, the best form of government that protects your Muslim identity is this form. That you don't need an Islamic State. And there's one passage in the Quran that's the one that I have the most difficulty with clerics. And it's al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi munkar, which means to forbid what is evil and to encourage, the reverse, to encourage what is good and to forbid what is evil. Okay? So that passage is used as a license by imams to say, well, Zuhdi, look, the Islamic State is mandated. It's not. I mean, all that says is, how do you do that? I was taught that the way to do that passage in the Quran is by example. That if I treat my patients well and humbly, that they will say, wow, why are you such a good person? And you explain to them, and you do it by example, humility, not by coercion, by government and by theocracy. And that's why anybody that says that the Islamic State is endemic in Islam, I would say, if that is so true, why does the Quran have nothing about government in it? There's a passage about consultation amongst yourselves, but there's nothing about how to run a state. There's a lot of laws, there's a lot of legalisms, but there's nothing about government and structure of society. So, if that is so nebulous, I think if it was so important to have an Islamic State, I think God would have spent a lot more time in the Quran explaining these things, but He didn't. So I think that's why, if you're going to identify with it, this is where I get intentionally, I think the Islamists propagandize what I do. They propagandize it saying that I'm trying to take away Islamic identity from youth. That's not true. I'm trying to tell them that the first part of maintaining the protection of their freedom to be Muslim is to be American. Or if Egypt has an establishment clause, to be Egyptian. But if Egypt ends up as an Islamic State, I would hope Muslims would say, you know what, we don't want to be Egyptian that way. We want to have an establishment clause so that it can protect our freedom to choose Islam or not, to choose a certain Sharia or not, etc. And that's why identity, I think, is really important, because once you identify with the Establishment Clause and the Bill of Rights, you inoculate that Muslim against radicalization. I have yet to have anybody prove to me that a Muslim that believes in our type of government could ever be radicalized by, Islamic, political Islamism. Yes.
I was just wondering briefly if you have, what you see for Canada. I'm Canadian. A lot of my friends are Muslim. I'm from Toronto. I was just wondering if you have a Canadian affiliate or... Oh,
we do. Our American Islamic Leadership Coalition includes the Muslim Canadian Congress. I don't know if you know Tariq Fatah. Tariq's a really good friend of mine. He's on our executive council, and so is Farzana Hassan, who else? We have a number of other Canadians that are on our... actually, Canadians are a bit ahead of us, and I don't know what to ascribe that to. There was almost a Sharia court system in Canada, and that whole anecdote is actually just amazing to me, and it shows you some of the obstacles that we have. The Sharia court system, the Muslim women's organizations actually were fighting it for some time, and they didn't want it. But it almost went into place despite what the Muslim activists, some of the anti-Islamists like Tariq and some of his groups were fighting. But then when the feminists came out against it finally, and they wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, that's when the Canadian government said, hold on, we don't want these separate court systems. And it sort of shows you that when you're a minority, sometimes you get pigeonholed that, oh, you must all think alike. And when there's diversity, you're not paid attention to until somebody in the majority. It's the same thing as the civil rights movement in the late 60s. You know, Rosa Parks and others, nobody would have paid attention to them unless the majority started paying attention to her and to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and others. And I think similarly in our coalition, many ignore the fact that we exist because we're a minority and we don't fit a certain paradigm. And I think in Canada, you know, the Toronto 7, I think, was it, in 2005 sort of shook up Canada because you had the attack was stopped, I think, very short of it actually happening. They had targeted a number of parliamentarians for an act of terror against them. And ultimately, now they're doing much more counter-radicalization programs. There is quite a bit of discussion about some of these Islamist groups. And I think the discussion is far more advanced as far as this discussion of engagement versus empowerment, et cetera. But initially, our American Islamic, we had really focused on the United States, but then when we learned about how far ahead of us they were, we said, well, let's make it North American because they've really been helpful in educating us about pitfalls and ways to work together as a diverse group of Muslims. Yes?
You mentioned tying being religious to the American identity, but I was just wondering if
To what?
Being religious to an American identity.
Oh, right.
I was just wondering if you see any danger of exposing another fault line between, say, non-believers and more religious people in America.
That's a great point, which is so let's look at the concept of church and state, is that there's an evolution of that process. There are some that, you know, I'm never of the opinion that we should make it illegal for people of, or say that it's wrong for people of the same faith to assemble together. That's obviously a big part of the American political scene, right, is various faith groups, and specific groups within a faith group will often rally together and assemble and have a political power of some kind. Do I agree with that? I personally don't. I mean, I'll tell you, you know, for example, let me set aside my AIFD hat for a second and tell you that, for example, on the healthcare issue, I wrote a piece criticizing Congressman Keith Ellison in Minnesota because he did a panel as a Muslim on why he should support Obamacare. And that and all these Muslim organizations came in and said why they were going to support Obamacare. And I said, listen, you guys are hijacking our community. Number one, many of us Muslims may not agree with that part of that agenda. And number two, that has nothing to do with faith. And if you want to argue the reasons of the policy, that's fine. But don't attach the fact that you're Muslim to the fact that there's a certain position and that somehow if you're against it, you're not for taking care of the poor or the impoverished or things like that. Now, the issue is if you fight too much against that, does it then, you know, are you then promoting too much secularism? And on the other hand, I know your question was on the opposite issue, which is that if I say that my faith identity is tied to Americanism, does that then make the space for atheists or non-believers then not palatable? I don't think so, because I think ultimately you don't want, the point is not demonizing others or promoting your own faith in politics, but rather to change the discourse to being one based in reason. But the issue is you can't get to these de-radicalization or counter-radicalization issues unless you discuss religion. So I would hope that a secular society not deem that it's going to protect its secularism to the point that we can't discuss faith anymore. And there's a lot of excellent books. I think there's a book called The Secular Age that was written by, it's about 800 pages. I can't remember, is it Kimball? No, I can't remember who wrote it. But it talks, I mean, it's a whole book about what you're asking me, which is how do you prevent a shift from towards theocracy by encouraging the discussions of religion in the public space. And I had a debate there. I don't know if you know Tom Farr at Georgetown, but he's a great advocate for religion in the public place. And actually, we were on a panel together in Washington, and he interpreted, my comments. Interesting. He ended up actually debating me on Al Jazeera. He was advocating for the ability of people to be religious in the public space, and I was advocating against that for Muslims. And I would tell you that we as Muslims you're talking about two different times in history. I feel we Muslims are in the 1780s, 1750s period, right? While Christendom in the West is in the 21st century, and it's a completely different issue. If our Muslim community had gone through an enlightenment and a separation of mosque and state, and now 200 years later, we were dealing with sort of the erosion of religion and the loss of the ability to even say, happy Ramadan, because secularism is trying to kill the public expression of religion, I might actually be more of, working with some Muslims to be more politically active and represent our faith. But that's not where we are intellectually. And I think that you can't separate history in those two discussions. And I know that's a roundabout answer to your question, but that's one of the most difficult issues with what I'm dealing with. Is so many Muslims say, well, Zuhdi, you're expecting something of the Muslims that you don't ask of Jews, of Christians, and of others. And my response is, I just think we're in a different time in history. Nobody wants to ask me about a passage in the Quran that is black and white and clearly says kill the infidels or nothing. What?
Can I ask about poverty?
Sure.
So I've read that a lot of radicalization is tied to the fact that, like, say Afghanistan, there's no schools there, so they send their kids to madrasas. So what would your response be to that, especially in places where there's no money to, like, build new schools or to,
Well, this gets to the solutions part, which is, I know when we were talking before with the students about this, about nation building and, how do you do that? And, we're going broke ourselves in America, so is that a good investment, or should we just be investing in our own country? I think ultimately because of the globalization of economies, and that if, as various countries may be on the brink of going bankrupt, if they do, that'll ultimately impact our own economy. So we have to balance what investments abroad may help evolve the global economy into a healthy one. And I think similarly, if we don't get into the competition that's happening on the ground in places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Syria and elsewhere, that vacuum is going to be filled by other interests. The Islamists that have been, if you look in Pakistan, it's interesting. The government is a secular military government, but yet they empower the Islamists and have been funding these madrasas that are radicalizing and teaching Deobandi thought, which Deobandism is the Wahhabi, is basically the Indo-Pakistani version of Wahhabism, which comes from Maududi. They have fed that because it allows them to create, basically the numbing of their masses through a religious radicalism. And if you're going to counter that, I think we need to do that through, as there's been microloan programs that many have given on the ground in places like Bangladesh, and Muhammad Yunus has done a lot of work on that. There have been a lot of small investment type programs, millennium funds that have worked with what have been called pay-as-you-go processes, where we help NGOs on the ground and we invest in small different areas, various countries and towns that we think are safer, and will give them some longevity, that they won't disappear in a few months after we start them up. And once you do that, you can create seeds for future generations. And I think it's money well spent. And I think Europe should do more of that, and we should be more critical of some of these countries. Qatar yesterday announced that it was going to invest billions in Egypt. Now that's interesting, or hundreds of millions. Now, that's interesting because Qatar is the home base of Al Jazeera, which is the home base of Qaradawi, who is the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. And if you look at one of the programs, one of the more popular programs on Al Jazeera is Sharia and Life by Qaradawi. So Qatar, as much as it may be a monarchy, has become basically the hub of the intellectual spread of Islamism globally. So for them to be investing in Egypt tells you that they see, the Muslim Brotherhood is one of the most popular Islamic websites in the world. Is called Islam Online. It's one of the top 10, I think, websites globally, and it is out of Qatar and has Cairo offices, etc. Now, Qaradawi went back to Cairo and gave a speech after the Egyptian turnover, and I think the fact that you see Qatar investing in Egypt tells us that we got to get in that game. It's, if we're not, you're going to see the Islamization of a lot of these governments. Any other questions? Yes.
Sorry. Even with education and in the first world countries, so I'll use Toronto as an example again. we have a big problem with immigrant ghettos, the ghettoization of certain groups. So there's an area, for instance, with about 30 high-rises that's almost exclusively new Canadian Pakistanis. And there's been issues there with sort of radicalization because it's such a closed community. So what can a government do there? What can Muslims do in those communities?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the Europeans are struggling with that quite a bit. I don't know if you remember the riots in France, that there was a summer, I can't remember what year, if it was 06 or 07, but there was a summer where there were neighborhoods that the French police said they hadn't been in 10 years. Even though it was under their jurisdictions, they were Muslim neighborhoods that were very ghettoized. I've been to the Netherlands 3 times, and the last 2 times our organization ran a citizenship and democracy program that the American ambassador in the Netherlands had asked me to do after he had gotten to know our work. And I went into some Muslim schools. Now, it's interesting. Now, in a country that supposedly separates church and state, the Dutch government, part of their separation of church and state is that they have to fund religious schools. That to them, that's the separation, is that you give religious education equal leg up. Now, in the United States, we have a very different interpretation of that. But as a result, there's 190 Islamic schools funded by the Dutch government. So you go into these neighborhoods. So they took me into some of the Islamic schools, and I talked to some of the schools, students that were 7th, 8th, 9th grade. Some of these Muslim kids hadn't taught. I asked them, when was the last time you talked to a non-Muslim? Some of them said 3-4 months ago. You know, so the government's paying for them to go to Muslim schools, to live in Muslim neighborhoods. Now, they have the freedom to do that. Nobody's saying they should be separated or somehow dispersed. But what you have to do is create programs of reassessing and reinvigorating what it means to be Dutch. And, you know, and I asked those students, how many of you would, and many of their parents, you know, Dutch is very heavily immigrated from Morocco and Algeria. I asked them, well, how many of you, you know, have been to Morocco? Most of them have. And how many of you would rather go back there? None of them. They all wanted to stay there, but and I asked them why. They really couldn't tell me why. They just liked being in the Netherlands. So they had an understanding. They liked the culture. They had some understanding of what it meant, but there was a very infantile, or you know, that's probably a harsh word, but a immature understanding of what it was to be Dutch and Westernized. And I think what you need to do is create immersion programs within a country, which is have them exchange with neighborhoods outside, create programs where they, just like we have inner city programs and other things in cities in America, you create programs that bring in ideas that, you know, one of the responses I think from the Dutch now is their citizenship test has a Dutch language test and other things. You know, some of that ends up being misinterpreted. And you have to be very careful on how to do that. I think the government and NGOs and others need to systematically work to create a common identity that they all agree in, and an ideology that is national, not racial, but national in its central origin, and stimulate artwork and poetry based on. And actually, it's interesting. The Israelis and Palestinians have been very good at that. I went to Haifa and saw a neighborhood that had monthly different art contests between the Palestinian and Jewish communities that they'd come together. And you know, with the month I was there, I saw them doing a work murals that they do on walls of coffee, different things about coffee, and work together and had contests. And I think those are the types of integration that needs to happen. Thank you.